So traditionally, the way the business has always worked, the seller's agent would negotiate with the seller for a fee, and the buyer's agent was paid as part of that fee, from that fee. So the only two negotiating were the seller and the seller's agent. With this settlement, the seller can opt for a variety of ways to pay their agent.
Hi, this is your mortgage guy, Dave Steinberg. Welcome to the Mortgages Made Easy podcast. We're sitting with Maria Rini, who is a fabulous realtor, been doing it for 30 years. She knows a thing or two about real estate. And over lunch, Maria and I had a conversation about what's going on in the real estate business, specifically for those of you who are not deeply involved. There was a major settlement of a national lawsuit against all sorts of realtor organizations earlier this year. And the result is it's going to change the way realtors work with you. And so I wanted to get Maria's take on this, and that's why we're here. Maria, tell us a little bit about how the settlement changes the way that you're going to do business in coming months.
David, I think just by to give kind of an overview of what is happening here and what came about, the intent of the settlement, and it's not finalized yet, but we anticipate it will be come mid-August. The intent of the, sorry, let me start here. Realtors have always negotiated commissions. There was never anything such as a fixed commission rate, and the media has gotten that part wrong. But the settlement wanted to allow sellers more control over who they were paying and how they were paying them. So traditionally, the way the business has always worked, the seller's agent would negotiate with the seller for a fee, and the buyer's agent was paid as part of that fee, from that fee. So the only two negotiating were the seller and the seller's agent. With this settlement, the seller can opt for a variety of ways to pay their agent, and whether or not they want to pay a buyer's agent. And the buyer will now negotiate with their agent as to how they will be compensated. So they're kind of splitting the buyers from the sellers. It's no longer one lumped fee that is somehow split between them. Both groups of consumers will negotiate independently. I'm sorry, where did we start this conversation? How will that change? How will that change for the consumer? I think we will move into a period of chaos surrounding the changes here.
Well,
For example,
let's be careful there, because
okay.
Yeah, so video editor, please, we're going to rephrase this a little bit.
Okay.
So let's start from the seller's perspective. You said the seller and the seller's realtor always negotiated a structure for their deal. And my understanding is that that piece of it is largely going to remain untouched. Is that true?
Yes, that is true. The piece that changes is the buyer. So this is already occurring in 18 states. Now it will happen in all 50. And a buyer working with a realtor will now need a written agreement as to how they will work together.
Okay.
That was not necessary in New Jersey prior to this settlement.
So let's start with the basic elements. Today, if I was a homeowner in New Jersey and I wanted to sell my home, I would have two choices. I could work with a realtor or I could do it by myself.
Yes.
Ah,
And there are
now,
several different business models as to how you might work with a realtor with a range of services, but yes.
okay, I could work with a realtor or do it by myself. And traditionally, meaning everything up to today, if the seller decided to work with a realtor, the seller and the seller's realtor would then come up with a compensation plan for any realtor representing the buyer.
That is true.
And that's the number one thing that's changing. Now,
That's right.
going back to my what I started with, I am a big fan of realtors. And I'm a big believer that if you're going to sell your home, you ought to have a realtor work with you, because the numbers bear out the fact that transactions where realtors are involved, the seller makes more money than they might make otherwise in the overwhelming number of cases. You can always point to one case where this guy saved $3, and you can, but when you look at the big picture, the seller's involvement with the realtor means that they have someone to negotiate with them, they have someone to represent their interests, and ultimately, the realtor, if you get a great realtor, someone like Maria, if you get a great realtor, you're going to be better off than if you try to do it on your own.
I can't argue with you there, Dave.
Okay. And the world of real estate is changing because now the buyers have to make their own decisions, right? Because it's no longer going to be bundled, right? That if the seller decides that they're compensating their realtor, it includes compensation for the buyer's realtor, that disappears. So now the buyer has to make their own determination as to whether or not they're going to have representation by a realtor and what that will look like.
Exactly. And I think that's where some of the confusion will come in. For example, a buyer can pay a realtor directly. A buyer can pay, as we do now, based on the sales price of a house or a percentage of that sales price. They can opt to pay an hourly fee. Some realtors may require a deposit for services before they will work with someone in the future. A buyer can opt to tell their realtor, I don't want you showing me any properties unless the seller is going to pay you, because I don't want to pay you directly. So there are a number of different models, and David, some of them, of course, may change the way you do things or put a curveball on the way you do things. For example, a buyer who tries to pay their realtor through financing it as part of their mortgage, which is currently not allowed for something like a VA loan. Why don't you talk about that?
Right. So the overwhelming percentage of loans will not have an issue, because, well, let me take that back. In many cases where the buyer is putting down a substantial down payment, let's say 20 or 25%, then the money is fungible, and so that's not an issue. There are some cases where the seller's agent will negotiate with the seller that there will be a compensation piece built in. And in that case, let's say there's a 2% buyer's agent credit attached to the listing. In that case, it won't be a problem under conforming loans, say the standard Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac loan. That'll be just straight sailing. It won't be a problem under FHA rules because that's fine. And it won't be a problem under VA rules because the seller is part of the whole transaction that is being subsumed within the transaction. It gets a little bit trickier if the buyer wants to have an agent under certain circumstances, particularly in low down payment situations. It's going to get tricky. And frankly, I think the world's going to have to see it play out and watch it. The number one question that people need to ask themselves is, how am I best served? Am I best served doing it by myself, or do I need representation? If it was your sister buying a home in Chicago, would you tell her to do it by herself?
No, not for a minute.
Even though you might be available on the phone?
Even though I might be available on the phone. One fun fact I read was there are an average of 267 people involved in a real estate transaction. You can't possibly know all those players. I mean, David, you've been around a long time. I've been around a long time. We know all those players, but for someone without real estate experience to try and manage that, it's nightmarish.
Right. You know, let's just talk about that because that's a great point. Today, when a buyer buys a home, particularly in, let's say, northern New Jersey, where you're located, the buyer needs a whole team of people. And you and I talked about this the other day. I love assembling a dream team where you have a great realtor, a great attorney, a great inspection person, a great insurance agent, a great team. But you know, there's so much stuff that we assume as knowledge that buyers don't necessarily know. So for example, the buyer comes in on their own and now they're negotiating a purchase contract and you're representing the seller, and you've done this hundreds and hundreds of times and the buyer has not. So now they're, I don't want to say defenseless, but now they're unassisted in that negotiation. And then the other thing that might happen, let's say, is now they need a property inspector, and unless they have someone who can guide them, they may have to just go to the yellow pages or Google and find the property inspector and not necessarily know how good that inspector is, even with all the reviews you get online. Then they get the report back from the inspector, and now it has to be interpreted. And if it's the first time you've seen an inspection report, boy, you're again left to the wolves. So there's all these things, and it goes on. Hiring an attorney, hiring an inspector, finding the right team, assembling the right team, negotiating, using all of that stuff. When a realtor's there, yes, it's going to cost you a couple of percent, but boy, you have somebody on your side who will help you with the negotiations. You have somebody on the side who will help you interpreting. You'll have somebody on the side who will be there for you, you know, even if in 75% of the cases, everything works smoothly, and I'm not sure that's the right number, but even if it were true that 75% of the cases, but this is the biggest transaction most people will ever do. And that 25% can be very, very scary unless you have the right support behind you.
Yeah, and it's not just, you know, if you're going into this and you're Googling the inspector and the inspector says, well, I can't do it for 2 weeks. And then you're looking at the contract you've just signed and, well, I've got to do an inspection before that. And how do I make this happen? With all of the players in the industry, you're going to buy a home, you're going to have that home inspector once, maybe twice in a lifetime. I've got a relationship with that home inspector. And like you said, there are hundreds of transactions we've done with this guy. So if we need something, we can get it done. We had that discussion earlier. If you really need to get it done, could you make a phone call? Could you make it happen? That's
Can
that's
you ask,
taking the stress out of that
can
whole
you ask
moving
for a
thing.
favor?
Yeah,
And with the relationship, with the history, the favor is a lot easier to come by than if it's the first time you're ever talking to someone.
exactly. Exactly.
So there's going to be a period stretching from sometime this summer, first, some months, where there's going to be some learning to be done. The sellers will have to learn some stuff. The buyers will have to learn some stuff. Attorneys will have to become aware of how to operate. And so what's the best advice you would give your realtor peers?
You need to educate yourself as to what the settlement looks like at this point in time and what the different business models that may appear during this transitional period, what they look like, how they impact your client, and how do you communicate what these different options look like for your client. Not all will be beneficial, and to make them understand the pros and cons of each approach. For example, the seller no longer has to, or tentatively as of August 17th, will no longer have to offer compensation to a buyer's agent. But should they? It's in my opinion that they should absolutely continue to offer compensation. As a seller, you get the highest and best price for your house when you can incentivize more realtors to bring buyers to your home. There will be a portion of buyers who won't look at homes unless their realtor is being compensated from the seller.
Because they
So
don't
you
want to
don't
pay
want to
for it
cut
out of their pocket. They're already.
exactly, but you don't want to cut down on that buyer pool. Bring in all the competition you can for your home. You're going to get the best price and terms for it. So I really think you're limiting yourself. It's penny wise and pound foolish, right? But you have to be able to explain to the seller why should you offer compensation to a buyer's agent.
And that's
And the same with the buyer and how they react with their agent and
yeah.
what that new buyer agreement will look like.
And so, as I told you, this is something the mortgage business went through 12, 15 years ago. And one of the things we had to do was learn the dialogue. We had to learn to express to our clients how we bring value. We had to learn to dialogue with people. And if I was talking to a realtor today who hasn't done this yet, I'd say, let's practice some role playing together. Maria, let's you and I practice what it might sound like if I'm the seller and you're trying to convince me to pay 2% toward the cost of the buyer's agent. And then build on it and sort of by role playing, you're going to get to some aha moments in the way you want to do business in this new world.
Yeah, and I also think with that back and forth, we can't anticipate everything that will come from a seller. We are kind of industry blind at times, right? We think everybody is coming from our viewpoint. And it's interesting, in the homes that I'm going into these days, maybe 50% of the sellers ask or understand that there's been or a change coming, there's been this lawsuit. Half are completely ignorant of it. And I think the seller population, the people who are engaged in real estate right now, they're probably more aware of it than your average consumer. If you're not, if you're not involved in a real estate transaction, why do you even pay attention to this, this piece of news? But it's interesting to me that still those who are engaged in the process are only about half are aware of what's going on. So I think education is going to be a huge piece of the puzzle. And I think there's going to be a lot of confusion around it when things first start to happen in August.
You know, it's funny. I had a conversation the other day with one of my clients, somebody I helped buy a home 30 years ago. And they were told that they need a pre-approval letter. And the first thing the guy said is, boy, we didn't need a pre-approval letter when I did business. Now it's 30 years ago. But you take a buyer or a seller who might have bought homes before, might have sold homes before, and now you're saying to them, well, you know, Mr. Seller, you're no longer going to have the old model where there was a single payer and there was a buyer's agent and seller's agent. Now it's a brand new world, and now we have to figure out what works best for you. And I think that's going to be an exciting time. And I think, as always, I think the best are going to be best prepared and going to handle it best. And they're going to be people who just fumble into it and fumble around, and hopefully they won't get hurt too badly.
Yeah.
And also the clients, if they're not adequately prepared, you hope that the clients don't get hurt.
Yeah. And I mean, it is such a unique time. I mean, we've been living through it for the past several years, but you know, we did roughly 4 million transactions last year. That's the lowest.
Wow, you had a good year.
That's the lowest, you know, the smallest number of real estate transactions in decades. So and again, unless you're involved with a purchase or sale right now, you may not be aware of that. But just the atmosphere that the buyers and sellers are working in right now and understanding that dynamic, and now we put this layer on top of it. It's a lot. It's a lot.
So in short, what I'm hearing you say, Maria, is if you're a seller or a buyer, find a great realtor and have a conversation and make sure you understand the model that you're being presented, how as a seller, how you're going to compensate the realtor, as a buyer, how you're going to operate, and where their value is. Someone like yourself who's done this for 30 years, who's counseled hundreds and hundreds of clients, and whose heart and soul is put into it. But and if you're a realtor, then game it out, play it out, understand the ramifications, look at the model that you want to operate under, because that's going to be so important, particularly in this period, in this falling out period.
So you know, it's interesting, David, because I don't know how paramount all of this will be relative to our extreme lack of inventory and how hard it is to buy a home these days. And the reason for that is, you know, the competition that we have. And to go back to a conversation we had not so long ago, when we were talking about people with lower down payments, and how do you try and prepare these people for the environment they're going to be working in, and how do you stack the deck? How do you get the team on board to allow them to buy a house? And you sharing your story of the ways that you and your team go the extra mile to present the buyer to the seller's agent, to really sell them on how qualified they are and how quickly you are going to take those contingencies off the table. I mean, that's just doing everything you can for a buyer in this market. And I think things like that will supersede, but I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
We're in for interesting times.
Yeah.
This has been the Mortgages Made Easy podcast with Maria Rini. We'll post Maria's information down below. And if you're looking for a realtor in Bergen County, Maria is fabulous, and I strongly recommend it. I'm Dave Steinberg, and thank you so much for joining us.